to a second segment with Sandra Brown. In the first segment, we've spoken with Sandra. We've told you who she is and all the awards that she's received. And also she gave us a good background about who Moira was and how did she go missing. And also how Sandra learned later that her father was involved in murder of Moira, and then how she got involved in finding more details about it. So we are going to talk more about that today. So Sandra, I want to ask you about, you mentioned in the last talk about your father, the conversation you had with him in 1992 on your grandmother's funeral. So if you can tell us more about that conversation and how that conversation led you to believe or the suspicion that your father was involved really in Moira's missing, and actually it was murder and there was some sexual assault history to that. So how did you make all those connections? Do you want to tell us a little more about that?
Yes, because I think people might wonder, why would she make that kind of jump? It's important to know that I hadn't seen my father for about 27 years. He was a womanizer who really abandoned my mother and my brothers and myself. And he kind of disappeared out of my life when I was 16. And to be honest, my thoughts were good riddance to bad rubbish, because he was not I think he was a good breadwinner. He handed in his pay packet, but he was a womanizer. He was a philanderer, is the word that would best describe him. And my mother could never be sure of where he was. So finally he went off with another woman, and maybe what tells you quite a lot about him is he would be 42, 43 maybe, when he disappeared. And the girl that he went off with was 21. And she was a bus conductress from the company where they were both colleagues.
Right.
So that tells you something. He had an interest in sexual partnerships with people a lot younger than him. Right. But I had no reason to believe he'd anything to do with the disappearance of Moira Anderson until I attended my grandmother's funeral. And he had travelled north from England, from Leeds. He had come north for her funeral, and we had a private conversation where I thought I would really tell him some home truths. I would say to him, in fact, what a waste of space as a father he had been. One of those kind of conversations, a bit confrontational. But the last thing I was expecting was that he would tell me that he couldn't understand why I was going on. And he said, everybody had forgiven him about his behavior. And he told me that his father, his own father, had forgiven him about Moira.
Yeah.
And that set a can of worms into motion, because he didn't think I would know who Moira Anderson was. And I said, no, I was only 8. She disappeared. She disappeared in all big blizzard of snow. But I know exactly who you're talking about. And I thought, what's this? What's this about his father? Why would my grandfather forgive you to do with Moira? Yeah. So that is what set this all in motion. And basically he was talking about 1957 and about how much everyone had liked him, how good looking he was, and the whole bit. And I mean, this is what he looked like a way back in those days. I mean, there's me. I'm about, about 7 or something there, 6 or 7, and I'm sitting on his knee. And this is the Scottish mountains,
right.
Very, very beautiful sunny day. And, he is a man there of, 36 in his prime, if you like.
It was just, you was around 6, 7, about a year or 2 years before Moira went missing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, she was She was 11 when she disappeared on 23rd of February 1957, but had she not disappeared, her birthday was the 31st of March, which was Mother's Day that year, and she would have been 12, and she was getting ready to go to high school. So she was one of the bigger girls that I didn't play with because they were much more sophisticated. I was in that 8-year-old age group where we were skipping and that kind of thing. But she disappeared. She was never seen. And all of a sudden, here was my father telling me in a private conversation in my grandmother's bedroom that his father had forgiven him to do with Moira. And then he told me that he had told the police at the time that this little girl, she got on his bus and he'd been the last person to see Moira. He had been the last person to be in her company. And that left me with a very, very uncomfortable feeling that, and I really thought, but has he really spoken to the police? And I decided I had to find out if that was true. Had he been interviewed by the police? And what I duly found out just a couple of weeks after that was, no, he had not been interviewed. And all my suspicions were aroused.
Yeah, and something like what we were talking about in the last segment, as I understand that when Moira disappeared that year, your father was already out on bail for a sexual assault case of a 13-year-old. Did that have something to do with your suspicion as well when your father mentioned Moira? And how did you make those connections that he was the one who probably murdered her and also perhaps sexually abused her?
Well, the thing was, at the time in 1957, clearly as an 8-year-old, I had no sense of what, you know, if you talked to me about him being out on bail, I wouldn't have known what that meant. I mean, if you'd said to me, did you know your father is receiving a sentence? I would have thought that was something to do with books and learning. I wouldn't have known. So it took a long, long time, probably till I was a teenager, before I discovered that my father had been sent to prison. I mean, we were told that he was away in a hospital and it was a mental hospital, which then, that was a terrible stigma. You didn't speak about it. It was a real shame thing for the family. So I, as a youngster, thought my father had been in hospital for a long time, but then Julie discovered, no, this was to do with a girl the same age group as Moira, and it was sexual offences, and he was given quite a lengthy spell in prison at the time. You know, it ended up being 18 months, but in fact, he was lucky. He was lucky that it was as, you know, looking back, we would now say it should have been rape, but in actual fact, it was more like they called it then carnal knowledge of a minor. We would now say lewd and libidinous behavior towards a child. Yeah. So yeah, you're right though. He was a convicted paedophile. So in actual fact, I got to age 42, haven't seen him for years. I'm sitting with him and just saying, you know, really, you weren't a good father. You weren't, you know, really, really laying it on the line. Lots of resentments that I had about, you know, really failing to look after us and the struggle it was for my mother. And, you know, amazing that I got to college. You know, other people were saying, oh, you know, you need to go and get a job. You need to work in a shop. You know, what about Woolworths? And my mother said, no, she wants to be a teacher. And I insist, you know, so she really pulled out all the stops to ensure that I got a good education. And, you know, I'll always be grateful for that. But really, I did really, I was quite hard on him, told him the home truths that I thought just was one of those conversations I thought, I'm going to clear the air here about a lot of things, and then I'm going to draw a line under it. And I will never, ever have anything to do with this man again, ever.
Yeah. But
And
that changed your life and the course of your life going forward. So what did you do then after that conversation when you started to have this hump that there was something wrong and you wanted to find out more about it? So what did you do, and then how did it lead to all the investigations? You're writing the book, so tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, I tried to put out sort of feelers round the family, what had been good. Did anyone else know? Had he been interviewed by the police? And several people said, oh yes, including an aunt of mine, a lovely aunt, who said, oh yes, I remember your dad. He said to your mum, don't put out my tea. Leave my tea. I am going to the police station round the corner, and I am making a statement because they think this little girl, Moira, who disappeared, might have got on my bus. And I'm going to say to them, no, there's another girl called Moira that I know, and it was her that I spoke to, because someone thought the bus driver, they had heard the bus driver say, hello, Moira. So he let it be known that he'd had this interview. But in actual fact, I didn't believe that. I thought it was very glib. Something didn't ring true. And the other thing that was very strange, Javita, is when my grandmother's funeral was over and we had we call it in Scotland a parvy. I don't know what you would call it in India, like the food. There's always like a, hospitality for those who've come to the funeral. Right. It's very important you get that right and people feel welcome and, the whole bit. But immediately the funeral was over, he left as quickly as possible. He didn't wait for things to be sorted out. And I thought, he knows he has said too much. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And I really, if you like, I think I started to realize I was opening a Pandora's box. Right. But I couldn't stop. And the more questions I asked in the family, what really shocked me was gradually my cousins. Now, I was one of about 20 something cousins, 22, 23. But everybody who was female, younger than me, almost everyone had been affected by his predatory behavior, apart from one girl who had emigrated to Canada with her family. She escaped his behavior. And then I was to discover that many of my friends and my neighbors had also experienced this same behavior, but they had never said anything at the time. Because as we know, it's very hard for survivors to disclose. I mean, how do you go up to a friend and you're playing games and say, well, I mean, what happened to me was I would go to their door and say, are you coming out to play? Skipping ropes, blind man's buff, whatever. And they would say, I'm not allowed to play with you anymore. And sometimes there was two sisters and they said, we're not allowed to play with you anymore, or go with you and your dad in his car. And I said, why? And they said, it's because of the marks that we got on our dresses, which made no sense to me at all. But something my father was very adept at doing, and which I now know is part of a horrible grooming process, is we would go to a park and there would be games, and then I would be sent to get ice creams for everyone. And during that short time when I was away, that is when he would try and, interfere, assault, molest, whatever you want to call it. Right. There are no nice words around this particular behavior, but that's when he would do this. Right. So that I was really used unwittingly as the word would be a lure. I was a lure, like to entice, which is horrible.
Yeah, yeah. So they all came forward and confessed later when you started the investigation, or when you started finding more about what happened with Moira. So other people and your cousins and friends came forward and shared with you.
Well, they did. And, you know, what I began to realize was there was very little in the way of support for women coming forward, whether they had been neighbours, friends, school chums. There was very little support. And I thought, do you know, there's got to be somewhere, you know, surely the police, but it was very rare then in those days. The police would maybe hand you a little leaflet and that was about it.
Mhm.
And, you know, victim support, Scotland was in its infancy. They didn't see this as, you know, being really part of their remit. They were dealing more with people who had been burgled or mugged.
Right.
But this was a whole different ball game. And I began to think, whatever happens here, I have got to make sure, even if they don't deal with my father, if they don't bring him north from England to face these charges, which ended up, there were charges to do with 5 of my female cousins. There's got to be justice for Moira. There's got to be justice for them. But whatever happens, I've got to ensure that there is somewhere set up where people can go and get support.
Yeah, yeah. And that's when you set up Moira Anderson Foundation. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I set it up after I'd written the book, which
Yeah,
you remember is called the
where
book
there's
here
evil.
is
Yeah,
Where There Is Evil. That I only wrote that when I got nowhere with the justice system. They
right,
refused to bring my father north. They more or less just said it wasn't in the public interest to take this any further. And so my cousins were left high and dry.
right,
Moira's family were left high and dry. And I
right,
thought, you know, the pen is mightier than the sword.
right. Yeah,
And I have to, and once I had written this down, and I thought, no ghostwriters here. This has got to be in my own words, and it's got to be written with integrity. And really, it has to be clear that I'm taking responsibility for every single word that I'm saying,
right.
because I could be sued.
Yeah,
Publishers could be sued,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know, the whole
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
So really what happened was, because it became a best-selling book at the time, that gave me the wherewithal to set up the charity in 2000.
Yeah, yeah. I guess at this point, I want to say that this book is definitely amazing read. I read the book when I met you, and I got it from you. So it's of course beautifully written, but it is so clearly written that you just get to understand what happened, and it gave me goosebumps so many times while reading the book, as you get familiar with what was going on and what happened, and all this your struggle of fighting with Scottish authorities, getting Moira Anderson and her family justice. So I would really recommend our viewers to read this book. I know it is available in leading bookstores. I saw it on Waterstone, so I'm sure they can
Kindle as
get.
well.
I'll get the link to the book to the stores in the description box so that people can read it. I think anyone who wants to know more about it, and the entire struggle of you finding the truth and getting it nailed down is very well described in the book. So I would really recommend this to people to read it. So thank you for sharing that. So what happened then, if we just kind of, before we end this segment, if you tell us what's the current situation of the case? Is Moira technically still missing officially, or do we know more about her, and what's the current situation?
The current status is an interesting one. Basically, in the 1990s, because the justice system wouldn't do anything, and it was very, very flawed. I mean, what I found out, and what is detailed in the book, is just how flawed the original police investigation was. Unbelievably flawed. And it was so flawed, I began to think, no, my father had some protection here. Yep. And yet, when I said, before the book was published, like 1997, I think it was, when I was saying, you know, really, I believe he's been part of a paedophile ring. People looked at me as if I had horns. You know, they were like, you know,
Yeah.
a paedophile ring? And the idea of there being organized people to do with this crime, I think it was just too much for people to get their head round. So then I began saying, why does Moira Anderson, why does she remain a missing person? Somebody tell me, because I kept getting told, oh, she's as pure and simple, it's a missing person. And I began thinking, I've got to get that changed, because as soon as you have someone saying this is a murder investigation, it's very, very different.
Changes.
Suddenly there are more resources.
Yeah.
Somehow or other, the whole thing pivots. And I began really asking questions. Why is this child's case? Why has it never been reviewed? Why does she remain a missing person? I had thought in my naivety that if you were missing in the UK for more than 7 years, you were automatically declared dead.
Dead. Yeah.
No, no. So what I then started doing was, the book had come out, the charity had got off the ground, I had got good people around me to help the charity to start to support survivors, good therapists, you know, good staff. And really, I began thinking, no, I have got to get a change in the law here. And what I do know is, I think because I persisted and wouldn't go away, finally, after a long, long time, one of the Scottish Lord Advocates, who's the Lord Advocate is the very, very top person in the Scottish legal system. Finally, a woman appeared. And this won't surprise you, Javita. Her name was Eilish Angelini, and she actually listened to what I had to say. And she couldn't understand either why Moira was not a murder case. And really, I got a great deal of support from her. And then she was actually followed by a huge coincidence. A Lord Advocate was appointed who came, believe it or not, from my childhood town, Coatbridge. Right. And his name was Frank Mulholland. And he's now a judge in the Scottish circuit. But he also found it extremely hard to believe why that was still the situation. And he went to Australia, he met Moira's sister Janet, and she said, you know, all these years she's still a missing person. And he said, I know, and Sandra Brown won't give up. Janet said, yeah, she's like a dog with a bone. So thanks to our persistence, eventually that Lord Advocate, Frank Mulholland, declared Moira's case in 2012. Right. Work out how many years it took, but he declared her case to be a murder investigation. And around about the same time, he decided that Scotland needed to have its very first cold case unit, because Moira's case is now one of the longest unsolved murders in Scotland. And notice I use the word murder.
Yeah, I know that's around about 2012 when I met you, and when you were telling me about these new dimensions that were taking place in the case. So definitely a big move forward from there. And I understand now, even during the lockdown, the investigation is going on, and there are more people coming forward to share.
I'd like to tell you, I think I'd like to tell you next a bit more about what's emerged in really recent times to do with Moira. Is quite unbelievable.
Right. So we'll take that up in the next segment. I think we've already done 15-20 minutes or maybe longer. I'm losing track of time. It's just so exciting to talk to you. So I'm going to stop this segment now. And for the viewers again, to tell you that we'll have the third and the last segment of my talk with Sandra, where we will talk about what's emerged of that case, as she just said. And also we'll talk about Moira Anderson Foundation, which is a great charity in Airdrie. And we really need to know more about that. And also, I think for me personally, it's important to know, and I think I've spoken with you, Sandra, about this, that where do you get all this courage to fight for justice and persisting on this case from 1992 to 2021, lockdown, no lockdown, COVID, no COVID, you just keep fighting, and you are adamant you are going to get justice. So I really want to know, and that would be again inspirational for many other people who are fighting for justice out there. So see you in the next segment. Subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell so that you get the notification whenever we have more interviews. But for now, leading on to the third segment. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.